The briefing dome on Corvus Station smelled like burnt ozone and stale victory, which was exactly how Tarek Vasoon liked it. He had his boots up on the console, which was against regulation, and a grin on his face, which was against nothing in particular except maybe good taste. Lyra Kessop sat across from him, arms crossed, the small leaf buds woven through her long trailing tendrils, swaying faintly with the kind of irritation that meant she was actually amused. Bren Ossick stood near the wall, fidgeting with a stylus, the thin gill slits along his neck, fluttering the way they always did when he was nervous, which was, generously speaking, most of the time. "Say it again," Lyra said, not looking up. "Say it again so I can laugh properly this time." "One human," Tarek said, holding up a single hand like it was the punchline to a very old, very bad joke. One. Singular. Soft, slow, practically blind in low light, and apparently it took out an entire garrison. Bren made a noise that was half laugh, half nervous hiccup, his gills flaring once. "That's not what the report says. The report says casualties consistent with hostile engagement," Tarek said, doing his best impression of a monotone command voice, which made Lyra's tendrils sway again, this time with laughter rather than irritation. "Consistent with hostile engagement. You know what that phrase means? It means somebody doesn't want to write down the actual number because the actual number makes them look stupid. Or it means classified," Bren offered. "It means embarrassing," Tarek said. "There's a difference." Lyra leaned back, one finger tapping against the console edge, a rhythm she did when she was thinking, or pretending to think. With her, it was honestly hard to tell. "I heard it was 6, she said. 6 guards, 1 human, and somehow the human walked out the front door without so much as a scratch." "I heard 14, Bren said. "You heard 14 because you want partial credit on every number that exists," Tarek said. "That's not unreasonable," Bren said, wounded. "It is extremely unreasonable. Count how many times I've told you humans are not actually dangerous. They are just loud, and good at making other species think they are dangerous, which is a different skill entirely. It is called marketing." That was when the door hissed open, and all 3 of them sat up just a little straighter, the way cadets do when they hear a senior officer's footsteps even before they see the officer attached to them. Mava walked in with a data slate under one arm, her pale ash-violet skin catching the dome's low light, the single ridge running down her forehead to the bridge of her nose, giving her face the look of something carved rather than grown. Her expression was, as always, professionally unreadable, which in Mava's case usually meant she had heard everything they just said and was deciding how much fun she wanted to have with it. "Vasoon," she said. "Kessop, Ossick, at ease. You weren't at attention to begin with, so I don't know what I'm asking you to relax from." "Instructor," Tarek said, swinging his boots off the console with the speed of someone who had just remembered boots on consoles were, in fact, against regulation. "We were just discussing the Velcor 9 incident. Were you?" "Hypothetically." "Hypothetically," Mava repeated, and there was something in the way she said it, a little curl at the edge of the word, that made Bren's fidgeting intensify by about 40%, his fingers bending at their extra knuckle joints in a way that always looked faintly unnerving to anyone who hadn't grown up around it. "And what conclusions did your hypothetical discussion reach?" "That the numbers exaggerated," Lyra said, because Lyra never backed down from a question, even when backing down was clearly the smarter option. "Command does this. They inflate enemy capability to justify budget increases. It's a pattern. We studied it in strategy theory." "You studied it," Mava said. "Interesting. And what number would you assign given your extensive theoretical training?" 6, Lyra said. "Maybe 7 if he got lucky with a door." 14, Bren said quickly, like he wanted his guess on record before anyone could take it from him. Tarek smiled the way he always smiled before saying something he thought was clever, the sharp ridge lines on his skull catching the light. "I'll go higher than both of them. Let's say 8, purely because 8 sounds like a number a panicking survivor would report, and then Command rounded it because rounding makes for a better headline." Mava looked at the 3 of them for a long moment, long enough that Bren actually stopped fidgeting, which should have been everyone's first warning sign. Then she set the data slate down on the console and tapped it twice, and the dome's center display flickered to life with a low blue glow. "I have the full sensor logs," she said, "recovered from the outpost's internal security grid before it went dark. Unedited. Time-stamped. I want you to understand that nothing you are about to see has been adjusted for, let's say, narrative convenience." "You're saying you have actual footage," Lyra said, sitting forward now, all her earlier swagger replaced by something closer to genuine curiosity. which on Lyra looked almost striking, like watching something elegant decide to be cautious for a moment. I am saying I have actual footage, Mava said, and I am saying that before we watch it, I want each of you to lock in your guess on the official record, so that afterward, when I ask you how wrong you were, you cannot pretend you said something smarter than you actually said. Fine, Tarek said. 8, locked in. I'm an adult. I can be wrong in public. 6, Lyra said. 14, Bren said. And then, after a beat, actually, make it 16. I want extra partial credit if it's close. Noted, Mava said, and there was the faintest twitch at the corner of her mouth that nobody in the room quite trusted. Let me give you the setup, since context matters here, even if you three don't seem to think it does. She brought up a star chart, a lonely little moon orbiting a gas giant on the edge of contested space, designated Velcor 9, currently home to absolutely nothing except rock, ice, and one forward outpost that the Kethrani Expeditionary Command had considered, in her words, about as dangerous as a parking garage. Garrison strength was modest, 22 personnel total, mostly logistics and light security. Because Velcor 9 wasn't a front line, it was a waypoint, a place where supplies got refueled and the occasional prisoner got processed before transfer to a real facility. And on the day in question, Mava continued, the outpost received exactly one prisoner for processing, a human, captured during a skirmish near the Halvern corridor. No weapon, no armor beyond a standard field uniform. Restrained, sedated for transport, and handed over for what should have been a routine intake and transfer. So he had nothing, Bren said. No gear, no gun, no backup. Correct, Mava said. Master Sergeant Connor Vale. That's the name on the file. And before any of you say it, no. The file does not list any unusual biological enhancements, no special training designation beyond standard infantry. Nothing that would have flagged him as anything other than what he appeared to be, which was one tired, restrained, fairly unremarkable-looking human male, currently unconscious, in a holding cell, on a moon with 22 armed Kethrani personnel standing between him and the only ship capable of leaving. So what happened? Lyra asked, and Tarek noticed, with some private amusement, that her earlier confidence had quietly downgraded itself into something closer to attention. Watch, Mava said, and the footage began. The first frame showed the holding cell, grainy, low light, time-stamped in the corner with the cold indifference of a machine that didn't know it was about to record something that would end up in cadet training modules for years. Connor Vale was slumped against the wall, restraints on his wrists, head down, dark brown hair falling forward over his brow, looking for all the world like a man who had simply given up. 2 guards stood outside the cell door, chatting, weapons slung low and lazy, the universal body language of soldiers who believed, correctly by every available metric, that they had nothing to worry about. Riveting, Tarek said. Truly edge of your seat material so far. Wait, Mava said. On screen, Vale's head lifted, just slightly. Not the motion of a man waking up. The motion of a man who had been awake the entire time, counting. His pale blue eyes moved across the cell, the door, the guards through the small reinforced window, cataloging, the way you might glance at a room you've decided to redecorate. Then his head dropped back down, and he went still again. He's pretending, Bren said quietly, like he didn't want to say it too loud in case it scared the footage. He's pretending, Mava agreed. The timestamp jumped forward 11 minutes, a shift change, a new guard arriving to relieve one of the 2 at the door. And in the 3 seconds where there were 3 Kethrani bodies clustered at that door instead of 2, distracted by the handoff chatter, Vale moved. There was no dramatic lunge, no roar, nothing that screamed combat. He simply stood, fast, restraint still on, and drove his shoulder into the cell door release panel at an angle that made the door's safety lock misfire and pop, which Tarek would later learn, courtesy of a very embarrassed engineering report, was a known manufacturing flaw that absolutely nobody had bothered to fix because nobody had ever expected a prisoner to know about it, let alone exploit it from inside a locked cell with his hands bound. That's not strength, Lyra said, sounding personally offended. That's just knowing things. Welcome to combat, Mava said. Continue watching. The door swung open into the gap between the 3 guards, catching the nearest one across the jaw before he even registered movement, and Vale was through the opening before the man hit the floor. The second guard raised his weapon, and Vale's bound hands came up together in one motion, not to block, but to redirect, shoving the barrel skyward as he closed the distance and then his forehead connected with the bridge of the guard's nose in a move so simple and so brutally efficient that Bren actually flinched in his seat, his gill slits snapping shut for a full second, a real-time reaction, not a performative one. One, Mava said quietly, almost to herself, like she was keeping score even though she clearly already knew the final number and was just enjoying watching them get there in real time. The third guard, the new arrival, the one who hadn't even finished his sentence about shift relief, took half a second too long deciding whether to shoot or shout, and that half second was the difference between being a name on a casualty list and being a man who got to go home that night, because Vale was already moving past him, sweeping the man's legs out with a low kick and slamming him face first into the corridor wall with enough force that the wall panel cracked. Two, Maba said. Tarek opened his mouth to say something sarcastic, found that nothing sarcastic was currently available in his head, and closed it again. The footage cut to a different camera angle, further down the corridor, where Vale, still restrained, moved with the unhurried efficiency of a man taking out the trash, dragging the unconscious guard into a side alcove, out of immediate sightline before working his bound wrists against the edge of a metal shelf bracket, sawing, patient, methodical, not even glancing toward the alarm panel that hadn't yet been triggered. "Why hasn't anyone sounded the alarm?" Bren asked. "Because the only people who saw him were the people he just put on the floor," Mava said. "And the camera feeds were being monitored by a single technician in a side room, who, and I want you to appreciate the layered comedy of this fact, was on a personal call to his partner about dinner plans and had the security feed muted in the background." "You're joking," Lyra said. I am very much not joking," Mava said. "The full incident report includes a formal reprimand for that technician, separate from the casualty section, which should tell you something about how this organization prioritizes paperwork." The restraints finally gave, and Vale shook them loose with the same energy a man might use to shake water off his hands after washing them, casual, almost bored. He took the sidearm from the second guard, checked the charge with a glance, and moved on. No hesitation, no triumphant pause, nothing that suggested he thought what he had just done was remarkable in any way. "This is the part where it gets," Mava paused, choosing the word with obvious relish, "interesting." The armory was 3 corridors down, manned by a single technician who, to his credit, did notice the alarm panel flicker before it actually triggered, and did manage to get one hand on his weapon before Vale rounded the corner. It did not matter. The footage showed Vale closing the gap in a way that looked, frankly, unfair, using the corridor's narrow width to his advantage, putting 2 rounds into the technician with the economy of someone who had done this so many times that his body had simply stopped consulting his brain about it. 3, Mava said. "Okay," Tarek said. "Okay, that's fine. That's three guys, big deal. 3 guys who were not expecting it. That's not the same as a real fight." "You locked in 8, Lyra reminded him, not unkindly, in the tone of someone reminding a friend they're about to lose money on a bet they made loudly and publicly. "I know what I locked in," Tarek snapped, and then immediately looked guilty about snapping, because Tarek's whole personality was built on not snapping, on staying loose, on laughing first. In the armory, the footage showed Vale moving with terrifying calm down the racks, selecting equipment the way a man might pick produce at a market, testing weight, checking charge levels, discarding anything that looked unfamiliar or unreliable, settling eventually on a standard Kethrani assault rifle, 2 sidearms, and, in a detail that made Bren actually laugh out loud despite the tension, a single grenade that he turned over in his hands for a full 3 seconds before tucking it into his belt with the expression of a man deciding whether dessert was worth the calories. "He's evaluating our gear," Lyra said. "He doesn't even know how it works, and he's evaluating it. He figures it out fast," Mava said. "Watch the door." The garrison commander, a heavy-set Kethrani officer named, the file noted, Sub-Commander Drasik Holvan, had by this point received the alarm and was mobilizing every available body toward the armory corridor, the single most logical choke point in the entire facility, the place any rational defender would expect the threat to either be contained or to break through. 9 personnel, the footage showed, moving in formation, weapons up, advancing on a single human with 3 confirmed kills and a stolen rifle he'd been holding for less than 4 minutes. "This is where I'd put my money on the garrison," Tarek said, trying to recover some footing. 9 on 1, even a good soldier. "That's just math." "It's exactly math," Mava agreed. "Watch the math." What followed was, even Tarek would later admit, the single most efficient piece of violence he had ever seen rendered on a training display, and he had sat through every available combat archive in the Academy's library, including the ones marked for command staff eyes only that he definitely shouldn't have had access to, but absolutely had access to anyway. Vale didn't meet the formation head-on. He used the armory's support pillars, ducking behind cover with a fluid economy that suggested either extensive training or some instinct so deep it didn't need training, popping out at angles the formation hadn't accounted for, putting controlled bursts into gaps in their advance rather than spraying wildly, conserving ammunition with a discipline that felt almost insulting given the circumstances. The first two Kethrani in the doorway went down before they'd even fully entered the room. 4, 5, Mava counted. A third tried to flank along the eastern wall, and Vale, without even fully turning, threw the grenade he tucked into his belt down a side corridor that the man was about to use as cover, the explosion catching him at the edge of the blast radius and putting him down hard enough that he didn't get back up. 6. That's not fighting, Lyra said, and her voice had lost every trace of its earlier sharpness, replaced by something quieter, more clinical, the voice of someone recalculating an assumption in real time, the small leaf buds in her tendrils gone completely still. That's just, he's 3 steps ahead of where they think the fight is. That's the entire lesson of this footage, Mava said. Continue. The remaining defenders, 6 of them now, regrouped into the corridor itself, the very choke point they'd intended to use against him. Except now they were the ones funneled into a narrow space with a man who had already decided, apparently, exactly how this particular geometry problem was going to resolve. Vale backed into the armory's reinforced doorway, using its frame as cover, and the footage showed something that made even Bren go quiet. No nervous laugh, no fidgeting, just wide-eyed silence. As Vale methodically worked the angles, dropping one attacker after another with single shots, occasionally diving low to avoid return fire that came in increasingly desperate, increasingly inaccurate bursts. 7, 8, 9, Mava counted, and the room had gone fully silent now. Even the ambient hum of the dome's air recyclers seemed to have politely stepped out. That's 9, Tarek said. That's already past my guess. We're not done, Mava said. What remained of the garrison, a final defensive cluster near the hangar bay where the only departing ship sat fueled and waiting, made one last coordinated push. 4 personnel, including Subcommander Holvan himself, who by every account in the personnel file was not a small man even by Kethrani standards, broad enough that most cadets in the academy would have walked the long way around him in a corridor out of basic self-preservation. The footage showed Holvan engaging Vale directly, hand to hand, after Vale's rifle ran dry at the worst possible moment, and for nearly 40 real seconds, an eternity in combat terms, it genuinely looked, like the math might finally favor the defenders. Holvan's reach and weight advantage were significant, his blows landing twice for every one Vale managed to avoid, driving the human back against a support strut hard enough that the entire room watching the footage in the dome audibly winced. He's losing, Bren said quietly, almost pleading, like he wanted someone to tell him otherwise. Watch his hands, Mava said. While Holvan pressed the apparent advantage, certain he had this contained, Vale's hand had found the discarded sidearm of one of the earlier casualties, lying just within reach against the strut, and in the space between one of Holvan's blows landing and the next one beginning, Vale brought the weapon up under the subcommander's guard and fired twice into his chest at a range close enough that the muzzle flash was visible, scorching the man's uniform. 10, Mava said, and there was no humor left in her voice at all now, just the flat recitation of fact. The final 3 defenders, watching their commander fall, broke formation entirely, which the footage showed was, if anything, the single worst decision any of them made that day, because a coordinated retreat might have actually saved at least one of them, while a panic scatter simply gave Vale 3 separate, isolated, much easier targets instead of one group he'd have needed to deal with collectively. The footage, mercifully, did not need to show every detail of what happened next in slow motion, and Mava let it run at a slightly accelerated speed through the final exchange, though the end result was not in any doubt. 11, 12, 13, she said, and the dome was so quiet now that Tarek could hear his own pulse, which was an experience he generally tried to avoid having in a training environment. The footage's final minutes showed Vale walking, not running, walking, through a hangar bay littered with the consequences of the last 11 minutes. Reloading the sidearm with rounds taken from the dead, checking the fuel gauge on the small transport shuttle docked there with the unbothered efficiency of a man checking the weather before a commute. He climbed in, and the very last frame of usable footage showed the shuttle lifting off the platform just as a flicker of static rolled across the feed, and the recording ended, presumably the moment the outpost's main power finally failed. "He flew our shuttle out," Lyra said, in the tone of someone discovering a new and deeply unwelcome category of insult. "He flew our shuttle directly into the recovery range of an Earth patrol vessel that had apparently been quietly shadowing the contested border for 2 days," Mava said. "Final tally, confirmed by both our own salvage team's forensic sweep and, embarrassingly, corroborated independently by a leaked human after-action report that somebody on our side should not have been able to access but did, because apparently operational security is a team sport and we are losing it. 13 confirmed kills, 1 sub-commander, 22 personnel assigned to that outpost total. 9 survived, several with injuries severe enough to end their service careers early." The number sat in the room for a long moment, glowing faint and final on the display, while the 3 cadets looked at it like it might rearrange itself into something less humiliating if they stared hard enough. 13, Tarek said finally. "I said 8. You said 8, Mava confirmed. "I said 6, Lyra said, in a voice that suggested she was reconsidering several previous life choices, possibly including her decision to specialize in tactical theory. "I said 16, Bren said, and then, brightening slightly, the way only Bren could brighten in a room this thoroughly deflated, his gill slits relaxing for the first time in several minutes. "I was close, actually closer than I thought I'd be." "You guessed high purely because you wanted partial credit," Tarek said, but there was no real heat in it anymore, just the exhausted reflex of habit. Mava tapped the display off, and the dome's lighting shifted back to its normal pale gray, somehow making the room feel smaller than it had a few minutes ago, like the footage had been taking up actual physical space, and its absence left a draft. "Here is the part of this lesson that actually matters," she said. "Not the number. The number is just a number. Numbers are easy to argue about. Numbers are what you 3 were doing before I walked in, treating a documented engagement like a betting pool. What matters is that every single advantage in that scenario sat with the garrison. Numbers, terrain, weapons, restraints, the element of surprise, all of it. And every single one of those advantages got systematically dismantled, not by strength, not by some secret enhancement buried in a classified annex somewhere, but by patience and timing, and a complete refusal to do what the defenders expected him to do in any given moment. So the lesson is humans are scary, Tarek said. The lesson, Mava said, with the patient weariness of someone who has had to correct this exact misreading many times before, is that complacency is the single most expensive mistake a soldier can make. And species that assume an opponent's quiet stillness means weakness are going to keep losing outposts until they stop assuming that. Master Sergeant Vale is, by every account we have, an entirely ordinary soldier by human standards, not a special operator, not a legendary figure in their own command structure. A sergeant. There are, by conservative estimate, several 100,000 soldiers in the human military with comparable training. That is the part of this footage that should actually keep you awake tonight, not the number 13. Nobody said anything for a moment. "I'm never running point on a prisoner transfer again," Bren said quietly. "Good," Mava said. "That instinct will keep you alive considerably longer than your math skills will." "Hey," Bren said, wounded again, but without much conviction behind it this time. Lyra was still staring at the blank display where the footage had been, her arms uncrossed now, her tendrils hanging still and quiet down her back. Her earlier sharpness replaced by something that looked almost like respect, filtered through several layers of professional irritation at having to feel it. "Do we know what happened to him?" she asked. "Vale, after. Still active duty, as far as our intelligence indicates," Mava said, promoted, unsurprisingly. "There's a standing directive in 3 separate sectors now that any captured human personnel above a certain rank designation are to be held under triple standard security protocols and never, under any circumstances, left in a cell with a faulty door release panel and bound hands and 20 minutes of unsupervised quiet time. That's a very specific directive," Tarek said. "It's a very specific lesson," Mava said. Tarek leaned back, finally, the grin returning, though it sat differently on his face now, a little wry, a little chastened, the grin of a man who had learned something and was trying to decide how to wear that fact without losing all his dignity in the process. 8, he said again, mostly to himself, shaking his head. I really thought 8 was generous. You should write that on a card, Lyra said. Frame it. Hang it somewhere you'll see it every morning before you open your mouth in a briefing again. I would, Tarek said, but I don't think the Academy issues frames large enough to hold that particular humiliation. Mava picked up the data slate, tucked it back under her arm, and headed for the door, pausing just before it slid open. For what it's worth, she said, the number isn't even the part Command worries about most. It's the calm. Every frame of that footage, he never once looked rushed, never once looked afraid. That's the part of the report nobody ever wants to put a label on, because there isn't a tidy military term for a man who treats a firefight like a chore he's mildly annoyed about having to finish before dinner. She left the three of them in the gray quiet of the dome, the display dark now, the number 13 no longer glowing but somehow still very much present in the room, the way a smell lingers after the source of it is gone. Bren finally set down his stylus. Lyra let her arms rest, loosely, on the console edge. Tarek looked at the blank screen for a long moment, and then, because some habits really do run all the way to the bone, he said, quietly, almost to himself, 8 would have been a respectable number, though. I stand by the structure of my argument, even if the conclusion was, in retrospect, wrong. Tarek, Lyra said. What? Shut up. And, for possibly the first time anyone in that dome could remember, he did.